The heavens, once an object of superstition, awe, and fear, now a vast region for growing knowledge. The distance of Venus, the atmosphere of Mars, the size of Jupiter, and the speed of Mercury. All this and more we know, but their greatest mystery, the heavens have kept a secret. What sort of life, if any, inhabits these other planets? Human life like ours, or life extremely lower in the scale, or dangerously higher? Seeking the answer to this timeless question, forever seeking, is the constant preoccupation of scientists everywhere. Scientists famous and unknown. Scientists in great universities and in modest homes. Scientists of all ages.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. The word from the professionals at the Community Hospital North Behavioral Health Pavilion in Indianapolis is that Rocco is doing relatively well, though he still has no recollection of his true identity. In the meantime, I've taken up a very cordial and rewarding correspondence with his chief physician, Dr. Hermes Delmont. He provides me with some very amusing anecdotes about Vernon Spatunia's rather elaborate stories and history, and perhaps one day I'll share them on the podcast. For now, I've decided to do something a little different for this episode, and don't worry, it keeps pace with our current trend of alien invasion movies that we've covered. Did you know, dear listeners, that our very first, very special Halloween episode on From Hell It Came and the Disembodied was not, in fact, our first foray into this project? No, for that, I'm gonna have to take you back to August of 2019. It was then that I first experimented with gabbing with my father about B-movies from when he was a kid. I hadn't yet thought of the name Monster Craze Memoirs, and while I'm not precisely a consummate producer now, I was certainly not prepared for the amount of technical difficulties I might encounter recording and editing a podcast. So what you're about to hear may have some hiccups and awkward transitions in parts, but I've done my best to paper over those errors as, while I wasn't really satisfied with it at the time, I really do think we got into a lot of engaging stuff that is suitably apropos of this phase of our survey. Where appropriate, I'll practice my due diligence and provide my own present commentary on the film, which I rewatched recently. The film that we covered in that very first episode of the as-yet untitled Monster Craze Memoirs was Invaders from Mars from 1953. The film, rushed into development by producer Edward L. Alperson in order to capitalize upon and preempt the release of George Pal's lavish adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, lacks both the refinement and superior acting of that more famous work. But what it lacks in refinement, it makes up for in the brute address of its apparent cheapness, counterbalanced by a veritably surrealist narrative and production design, the latter courtesy of the director, one William Cameron Menzies. Invaders from Mars tells the story of David McLean, played by famous child actor Jimmy Hunt, who, one dark and stormy night, witnesses a flying saucer descending and disappearing into the fields just beyond his backyard. When David's father goes out to investigate, he disappears, only to return early the next morning with a completely new, cruel disposition. Realizing that something has gone horribly wrong, David attempts to tell any adult authorities who will listen about the dangerous forces visiting his small town, but finds that these adults either do not trust him, or are themselves rapidly falling prey to the same sinister control. So I remember when I was a kid, I forget how young I was, but I think we got a one time Mom and I were somewhere and we got these two VHSs. One was or maybe I got it as a gift from Aunt Karen, but anyway, we got like one was a VHS copy of Godzilla King of the Monsters, but the other was a VHS which was called it was a collection of movie trailers from the 50s and the early 60s, which were all B movies. And I guess for most of my life, that was my primary way that I learned about and knew about these sorts of films. And one of the I think the trailer that stuck out the most to me when I was a kid and watching them, because I would watch this VHS over and over again, but the one that stood out to me a lot was for a movie called Invaders from Mars.
In 1953's classic Invaders from Mars, Martians invade the Earth, abducting people and turning parents into zombies, all under the control of a bodiless Martian brain in a bottle.
Invaders from Mars. He saw them land from outer space. He saw them capture innocent people only to destroy. Father turned against son. People changed into strange, weird animals. A general of the army becomes a saboteur. Trusted police turned into arsonists. The boy's parents changed into killers.
But nobody's getting anywhere out there. Nobody can locate anything, anybody. The Martians, we've got to stop them.
Invaders from Mars, capturing humans at will for their own sinister purposes, turning them into diabolical instruments of destruction. Invaders from Mars, weird, fantastic beings of a superintelligence, ruling a race of synthetic humans and pitting them against mankind's dream to conquer the universe.
Come on, step on it. Search every tunnel. We gotta find Ronaldo and the kid. When the colonel gives a signal, get back here on the double.
I didn't know it intuitively at the time, but it was a lot different than the other trailers that were on the tape, because most of them, they were pretty, what there was there for a kid to really gravitate to in those old movies, which is just, the bad special effects, the bad cinematography, and just the ridiculous looking monsters. Like, I think Robot Monster was on there with the gorilla in the diving helmet. The giant claw was on there with this ridiculous looking bird from outer space. But with Invaders from Mars, there was this... there's this sort of surrealist quality to the movie, or that you even notice it just watching the trailer, just how the sets are designed and the lighting scheme of all these harsh green colors especially, and these pulsating reds. And of all the movies that I've tried to track down and, actually watch and get a handle on what they were like, I think Invaders is one of the ones that it has a really bad preservation history. There's the only copy that's available now is a DVD from the published by Image Entertainment from the early aughts. And, even in this, this very cheap restoration of it, it's still there's lots of scratches on it. There's lots of little hiccups and errors in the soundtrack. And it's kind of like one of these tragic examples of a movie that has been sort of neglected and left behind. And it's really unfortunate because while it's relatively easy to find fairly good, transfers of a lot of these movies, and I guess a lot of that comes from just the sorts of studios that now own the rights to them. But Invaders from Mars is different because it doesn't have a very good preservation status, but it's a beautifully made movie despite its incredibly low budget. And I was wondering how, did you see this movie when you were a kid?
Yes, probably I did, but I don't remember it as much detail as
because it came out in 1953, so you were too young to see it in theaters. But it did have a history of being broadcast over and over again on television.
Right. Because basically there's no real violence to a point where it would make it objectionable for any child to see. And you're right. I think it was a well-crafted film. I thought that the use of the matte backgrounds are just absolutely stunning. So it reminds me of the matte background.
Or we should say matte background, because instead of matte backgrounds, plural. Because there really is only one.
Well, is it just a backyard scene?
Yeah,
looking out?
And people have,
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
It's an extremely low budget movie, and it seems like the entire budget of it is sort of bound up in this one set piece, which is the backyard of the protagonist, who's
overlooking the sand.
Yeah, this
area.
kind of amateur astronomer.
It reminds me. Yeah. Oh, you're right. Absolutely. And even because the sky background is also fake, right? So
yeah.
But it's really well done. I thought it was a really excellent.
You said it reminded you of something.
I was thinking of where matte backgrounds have been done like that in other pictures. It almost gave me the sense of what's it called, the coffin of Dr.
The cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah, so how the people disappear and sort of like stick behind things. Almost like that, but it had that feel to it, and also the matte backgrounds that you see in Dick Tracy, Warren Beatty's direction. But although they're more garish because they're more modern, so he's able to do more with them. But you're right. I think that the other thing is the whole script. I think is wonderful. I think that it's one thing for a change is that there's no disbelief in it. That they believe the kid.
Well,
with minimal, and which is kind of interesting.
It builds to that point, doesn't it? But
yeah.
But that was the other thing. And I remember being, and I guess one of the things when I first saw the trailer when I was a kid, and the thing that sort of impressed me about it at that young age is because it is one of these few examples of science fiction movies from this period that, rather than being about adult authority characters, whether they're reporters or military men or, some variation of an authority figure, the central protagonist is a child. But it's also a film that's done entirely from a child's point of view and in terms of a child's logic. That's the other thing, is it is a wonderfully written movie to a certain extent. But appreciating that, I think you have to approach it in a way that disaggregates your appreciation of the script from the assumption that I think a lot of people might make, that the sort of loose logic of the story is just a product of laziness or bad writing, as opposed to it being deliberately written this way. Because I think, there are lots of
you found me chuckling in certain points, but then what I saw is that all of a sudden, like for example, the astronomer who believes the kid almost immediately, because why does he believe him? Because he already has a history of this kid. This kid knows, they know each other. So I think that's part of and it helps to move the plot along very easily, because now you don't have to spend a lot of time of disbelief and trying to get around disbelief and having people.
Yeah, because it's very, and it is, and the way it does get around disbelief is, again, by putting it in the point of view of a child character. It's also such an oppressive feeling movie, because his instinct is to just go to anybody he can to try to get them to listen to the fact that, number one, just this entirely horrific premise of
Right.
your father disappears and then he comes back one morning and he, instead of this benign figure, he's now this cruel, abusive person.
George, you're safe. I was so worried.
What happened? I thought he'd gone to the plant.
Never mind, David. What did happen to you?
I stopped over to see Bill Wilson.
In your pajamas?
In my pajamas, obviously.
But...
Period.
Where's your other slipper?
I said period.
Well, I guess we'd better tell those policemen.
What policeman?
Well, I was so worried, George, I called the police. They're out there looking for you now. Go and call them, David, and tell them that
You
you're...
stay where you are. Are they out there now?
Yes. What happened, George? What is it?
I wish you'd please learn to mind your own business.
Sorry.
Those policemen, they'll ask questions, and I can't.
But what if they do? Why can't you
Am
tell
I going to
me?
get my coffee?
Say, Dad, when you're out there, did you see anything?
Let's not start that flying saucer nonsense again.
What happened to your net? It looks like there's a
Nothing. I caught it on a barbed wire fence.
barbed wire, but there isn't any barbed wire between...
I caught it on barbed wire, I said!
Which is instantly terrifying to a child. Just the idea that, that your loving parents could be replaced by this, nefarious
Right.
force. Having the opportunity to comment on that part of the film a little further, and kind of what I think is so disturbing about it, and how successfully the filmmakers appeal to the kind of primal fears of a child, is that I don't think it's just about the sort of, it's not just about the replacement of the father. It's not just about like the dream logic or the fairy tale logic of a benign father who goes out and he, and then what comes back is this evil doppelganger. I think it appeals much more to this, this feeling you have as a child as you grow up and you first start to experience the complexity of your parents, where, they are there to love you and they're there to take care of you. But I think we all, no matter how loving our households are, I think we all have a distinct, whether it's a clear memory or just an impressionistic memory, we all have memories of just, the mask of security and being in control, slipping away from our parents and them, blowing up, so to speak, even at seemingly minor things, at least to a child's point of view. I think that's another element of the story that the film appeals to, and that the writing greatly taps into, which is just the subtle ways that we pick up on as a kid that our parents aren't replaced, but that, they themselves, because they're in control, they're also exactly what makes them symbols of security and authority, also makes them figures of terror. They can blow up at any moment. They have power over you, and sometimes there's, they're hiding a monster behind themselves that often comes out in terrifying ways. Later in this podcast, I really unfairly critiqued the acting of the film, but I do want to give a special shout out to the guy who plays the father in the film, Leif Erikson. He does a really fantastic job of playing this character who goes from benign to malevolent, but he does it in a way that I think is totally wonderfully consistent with the way the film is written and directed, where even when he's playing the benign character, particularly in this one great close-up shot where he's putting David to bed on the night before the saucer lands, and he's just looking at his son, beatifically, and being very proud of his son. But I think Erickson plays the scene just right, where the way he's looking at David is so, it's much more obsessive, and I think a lot more projecting onto the child in a way that it really wonderfully foreshadows the uncanny and twisted nature of the story, that I think he's doing a really great job of foreshadowing where the character is going to go, and it giving you this sense that this monstrous turn that he takes early in the movie is almost like a manifestation of something that's darkly hidden, which turns out, I personally think, in my reading of the film, to be very important to the film's themes of this idea that conventional authorities are masked in their benignness and in their seemingly unquestionable power and trustworthiness are hiding a kind of nefarious, diabolical inner self, which is only magnified by when the shot itself is repeated towards the climax of the movie. But we'll get to that in due time. But then building upon that, he tries to go, first just to people he knows in his town, just to basically any adult who will listen. I think first he goes to the parents of a girl who he sees disappear behind the hill, because basically what happens is the way the disappearances are conveyed is that people will, again, they'll go up this set, which is just this hill in his backyard, and they'll just fall into the ground and disappear. And so one of the very disturbing shots in the movie is just him looking through his telescope, almost in a Hitchcockian kind of way. He's just looking through his telescope, and he just sees this little 8-year-old girl walking along a fence, and then she just disappears. And so he first goes to her parents to try to convince them, but then when she reappears again, she's just this terrifyingly blank and sadistic looking character who ends up setting a fire, like a gas fire in the house. And then he tries going to a gas station attendant that he also apparently knows. But of course, the problem he keeps encountering with all these authority figures is that their immediate instinct is to try to contact his parents.
Right.
And so there's this terrifying situation where it's like, no, I'm trying to warn you about the fact that, the
right. Was his mother wasn't yet changed. It was the father only, right?
Yeah, and that's another really terrifying scene, because he's put in a prison cell for his own protection, and then his mother shows up to get him. And so again, you have this horror, and that's a great way to plot the story, is that there's sort of this suspense, because we do see the father taking the mother up the backyard set to the place where she's apparently going to be taken over by this force. But then she doesn't appear again until the prison scene.
Right.
And so from his point of view, he desperately wants to believe that this is still his mother. But we, in the audience, we have this feeling of dramatic irony where we know before he does that she has been turned to. And luckily, there's a child psychiatrist figure who intervenes at the right moment and is able to rescue him. And at that point, you are right. After that point, there is this sort of change in the plot where suddenly all of the authority figures are more attentive to him and they believe him implicitly. And so then the movie, and the movie continues, but the movie continues to along that line of a childlike logic where, everything sort of happens so simply and straightforwardly. But there's still this sort of, there's this surrealist removal from any kind of logical progression. And this is something I thought about, particularly with the little girl who disappears and then shows up and lights the fire at her home. The thing that I realized is that, part of it must have been just a function of the small budget that they had.
Whatever the writers did, they did a remarkable job of suspending disbelief.
Yeah.
Through good writing. The psychiatrist, as you know, protects him immediately.
Yeah.
Says, well, but he has a fever, so he's under our observation right now.
Yeah.
She wouldn't release him to the mother, which is her right. She doesn't have to. She's the authority, so she could actually take the child away from the parent. Mm-hmm. And that was an important point, right? That was an important time. The astronomer, his friend, his
Dr. Kelston,
right?
Yeah.
who smokes a pipe and doesn't realize that that pipe's going to get him into trouble when he has a coelacanth blood drop in it. But that's another story.
Are you talking? You're talking about Monster on the Campus.
Right.
I don't think it's the same actor.
Yes, it is. It is.
Is it the same actor, Arthur Franz?
Yep.
There's no way.
Yep.
One sec.
It is.
Oh my God, you're right. It is the same actor.
So the pipe
smoking. That is a very nice way of thinking about it. Although he's a biologist in that, he's a
right.
Yeah.
Well, he changed. Well, obviously, he didn't learn much. Anyway, the idea is that he explains that. Well, one way we know. You know, he goes through.
You did point this out when we were watching it. Is that he does give this He basically explains everything that's behind,
which is perfect,
behind the veil of what's going on before
they probably buried themselves in Mars. We think they're below the surface if there are intelligent people.
But it's a spaceship. Where could it go?
What, right in the ground? I saw it.
Oh, it can't be underground.
Can't is what our grandparents said about the airplane. Besides, we know nothing about these people, if they are people.
What do you mean?
We do know this. There isn't enough oxygen on Mars, and the surface is too cold to support human life as we know it. There is a theory, consequently, that their cities are underground, near some central core of heat, or that they live in spaceships.
And this is the other
Which
interesting.
Is cool, 'cause it all works.
This is the other interesting thing is that that's not a total original production of the filmmakers. Like that is a sort of. That is, one of several sort of pseudo-scientific theories that go back to the 19th century and the early 20th century where people were, looking at Mars and understanding that this,
the canals.
That's another thing. I remember learning that very early on, like when I was in middle school and started getting into like sort of UFO research and the pseudoscience of intelligent life on Mars, that apparently there was a huge contributor to the popular misapprehension that there could be life on Mars contemporaneously as opposed to what more rigorous scientists were proposing, which is that Mars clearly shows that at one point there may have been conditions that could have sustained life, whereas now it's a barren red planet. But the idea was that, some French astronomer, he was just looking at these trenches on Mars, and he called them channels. But it was mistranslated in American, it was mistranslated into English from channels to canals.
Right.
So in the English-speaking world, there becomes this popular misapprehension that the man is proposing that these are specifically man-made waterways, as opposed to what he was saying, which is no, these are just natural waterways that existed sometime before.
Right. Well, there were at the time when I was younger, there are changes in the polar.
Yeah.
Ice, they're not really ice.
They were first, because telescopes were getting to the point that we were first starting to realize that there's ice on Mars.
And it changes, right, over
and that
through
it
the
changes
cycle.
and melts in cycles. Yeah, so but also there were pseudoscientific sort of theories about the idea of like, could the people of Mars be living subterraneously, and that's why we can't see them, but we only have these canals and relics of their early civilization. So that part is extrapolated from contemporary sort of pseudoscience. Mm-hmm. But
it wasn't pseudoscience at his time. It was because we didn't know any better, right? We didn't know any better we didn't have the optics to look at Mars or the scientific understanding of. So anyway, yes, it is pseudoscience that grows out of it, because then it launches a whole bunch of Martian movies, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess we as far as I do with that scene in particular, but like also the way that the role of this character is to basically foreshadow everything that's going to be revealed in the story.
Initially, I chuckle at it because I said, "Well, that's pretty." What do you call it?
He even just randomly comes out with the idea of like, well, these Martians have developed these synthetic human slaves, that they use at their whim that they call mutants. For whatever reason, they pronounce mutants as mutants.
You don't believe that.
I'm a scientist.
But it can't be proved.
Can't be disproved either. Could you disprove, for example, that the Martians have bred a race of synthetic humans to save themselves from extinction?
Synthetic humans?
The theory calls them mutants.
Mutants?
But like it's really it's such a strange observation for him to make because there's no precedence in it for anything that comes before.
Right.
He just brings it up.
Right.
But then eventually we finally see the spaceship and we see, oh yeah, here are the mutants. It's like,
but not so much that, but the idea is
he's exactly right about everything.
He's able to take his telescope and look at the backyard of his house again.
Yeah, that's the
and
other
actually
thing.
see the general disappear.
Well, yeah, we're condensing
yeah.
sort of scenes together here, but yeah, so he's
he's
very instrumental in sort of.
Right.
But another thing that I wanted to bring up about that scene in particular, which is the proposition that Kelston makes, which is that, you know, the characters are wondering, well, why are the Martians coming here? And Kelston hypothesizes that the reason the Martians have come here is because they have been provoked by nuclear proliferation.
No.
And the development of Earth's technology.
A rocket?
I thought they were testing some sort of atomic device out there.
It is an atomic device. The highest powered rocket ever conceived. You see, once we can shoot a rocket far enough into space, it will just anchor there. Then it's merely a matter of time before we set up interplanetary stations equipped with atomic power and operated by remote control. And if any nation dared attack us, just by pushing a few buttons, we could wipe them out in a matter of minutes.
Then you think it's on account of the rocket
Well,
that they...
put the shoe on the other foot. Say you're a Martian. With the aid of these mutants, you've developed a way of life to save your race. Giant ships floating in space with sufficient oxygen to sustain life. Then the inhabitants of another planet start shooting powerful rockets, endangering your zone of survival. Wouldn't you want to do something about it?
Well, they're angry because they've got what is it? He zooms in on the new spaceship.
Yeah, there's just this gigantic spaceship in the middle of the industrial district of this Midwestern American
town.
So
part of the whole thing,
yeah.
I think it's in the same scene. He says, "Well, yeah, they're scared. The Martians are now scared
that
because we're already there. So that means we're going to start invading them.
Right.
So they're going to come in and sabotage us.
Right.
To
it's basically a it's basically a unilateral first strike in order to prevent the inevitable.
Right.
Which
is one space.
Which is something, you know, and that is something that's also a premise of The Day the Earth Stood Still. So that may be somewhere where the film is borrowing it, but again, this is another example of something that the movie is actually drawing from real popular culture at the time, because in 1950, you know, like from 1947 to 1950, that's when sightings of UFOs and UFO.
Oh, we had Sputnik too, right? 56.
56, but that's where, you know, but that's where you're sort of balancing out the UFO hysteria. Like, you know, there's a whole way of looking at UFO hysteria in the United States where basically you treat it as being, it's just symptomatic of a larger Cold War paranoia and hysteria that's going on in the country, that it's an expression of this anxiety that people feel collectively, where, you know, they are, like you're saying about Sputnik, people are watching the skies and they're more and more attuned to the idea that, you know, there's just this other nation behind an iron curtain that is just going at its own pace and possibly developing all of this, you know, this apocalyptic technology that they're going to come and invade and get us. But as far as that specific hypothesis that Kelston proposes, again, that's something that is drawn specifically from popular UFO research, because in 1950, a guy named Donald Kehoe, he publishes a non-fiction independent research and conspiracy theory book called Flying Saucers Are Real. And in Flying Saucers Are Real, Kehoe, his whole hypothesis is that the reason that well, number one, the source behind all of these UFO sightings all over North America, the reason they're exploding is because these are actually visitations by extraterrestrials. This is alien technology that we're seeing. It's not the Russians. It's not secret American experiments or top secret military experiments. It's aliens. But the hypothesis that he gives for the reason we've seen this explosion in sightings, an explosion in visitations, and specifically in the American Midwest, is because of nuclear bomb testing. Is that he himself proposes that this is the reason aliens are being provoked into visiting and scrutinizing us because they're seeing our disastrous technological capabilities, and they're trying to monitor us to see, you know, how far this is going. I do want to kind of go back to, though, the scene where he goes to the house of the little girl to warn her mother and her father that she's disappeared. Mm-hmm. I think, again, this goes back to the sort of childlike logic, again, that it's not just a story where a child is the protagonist. It's a story where it's a story that is told from the point of view and through the logic of a child. So what we see in the scene is that, you know, this little girl disappears and then she shows up. She's been taken over by this evil Martian, you know, brain control. And then we see, like, that she's apparently set a gas fire in the basement of her house. And then, totally off screen, after the boy runs away, the boy's named Danny, I think, and the boy runs away, you know, completely David, completely off screen, the house has apparently burned down, and the little girl has died of a brain aneurysm.
Right.
And it's this horrific implication of all of these things that we don't see. Number one, just as a function of the budget. They didn't really have the money to show. Right. But like you're saying, they don't have to show it. But then it just sort of brings together, like, this weird sort of childlike, surreal logic to the story. Because it's never actually established why the little girl burns down the house. Or why it's necessary.
Right.
Because at another point in the story, this scientist, David's father and mother are turned into, like, assassins. And at one point...
Well, saboteurs.
Yeah, saboteurs and assassins, and they attempt...
Right, assassins, right. They try to kill the guy who actually becomes the Neanderthal. So there's a lot of these guys appear again in B-movies again. So the actor who plays that guy for a very brief scene... Robert Shane. Yeah. He shows up in a number of B-movie type things. So
yeah. I guess there is a certain logic to it, because it turns out that guy is it turns out that he's a chemist who Correct. Is working at the top secret factory in this small Midwestern town that is developing the space shuttle. Right. But there's
somehow he's working with chemistry.
But this is the thing, is that, like, you know, the one thing you have to ask is, like, well, they've already taken over the parents, so why take over the little girl and send her on this parallel?
Well, she fell there by accident.
But then if it's an accident, why send her? Why not just keep her? You know, and that's well,
they send them all. Oh, that's a very good point.
But this is what I'm saying is that, like, there's technically a logic, because you could just say, well, the girl is trying to...
Oh, no, I know why. The girl is actually the daughter of the guy who's the chemist.
Right, but this is I know that, but what I'm saying
that's why
it doesn't. But I'm saying it doesn't explain it, because they've already taken over the father. They've already, and again, that's the other thing. The father also works at this facility. That's the other sort of, another thing about there's all these elements of the plot that we're technically given exposition about it, but again, there's no attempt to ground it in a kind of logical progression. Because first the father is taken over, and then eventually, during the climax of the film, he attempts to assassinate the chemist guy. But then earlier in the story, the daughter of the guy is also taken over and presumably burns down their house in an attempt to kill him.
Right.
So there's this childlike logic which is sort of divorced from a logical progression of like, wait, why did they do that rather than just sending the father, who is already working in the same place as this chemist, why didn't they just send him to do it? So there's this way that the narrative proceeds, which seems to be exclusively governed by just this chaotic sequence of events that doesn't necessarily have a logical progression to it. It's almost like it's just these horrific ideas that are just being spontaneously manifested from the point of view of a child, rather than actually being grounded in like some sort of meticulous Martian plan, you know. I just thought all of those aspects really work to help sort of.
I just think it's not I think it's just the fact that the Martians don't have control over these people; they have to be captured. So, I just think I don't see it that way. I don't know. A lot of things I don't see, but in any case, it's just happenstance. Because whenever they capture someone, they interrogate them to find out who they are. Once they find out who they are, then they realize, do they change them?
Yeah, they plant a probe into the
brain.
Back of their brain.
Back of the brain that leaves a mark that the kid sees, right?
Right.
So it just turns out that she was useful because they found out that she is the daughter of the guy who's also... The question is, how did they find out that this guy is actually doing... You know what I mean? So,
right.
I know how it works. If the father gets taken first, he has all the information. He mentions in their debriefing of this individual once he's captured, in theory, they debrief him about who worked, where do you work, who is the, et cetera, and it grows from there. And then everything seems to have a logic, at least not a strong logic, but the web, you see the tendrils. It isn't as if it's so far-fetched. It isn't totally random. So it makes sense the way. If they debrief the father first, like you said, then it seems to reach out. Now, when Jimmy seems to...
They could just send him to work and have him, like, I don't know, just, like, stab the guy.
Well, they also said somewhere in there...
But that's the other thing. There's also no explanation of why the chemist needs to be killed rather than brought, also be taken over. Like, again, it's like there's all these...
I don't know.
Again,
there's an immediate security placed on the facilities, right? So,
right. The emphasis seems to be more on... That's what I'm saying, is that the emphasis seems to be more on the conjuring of these people that the child knows personally and the transformation of them into these monsters, rather than anything to do with it could be like you're saying, where the Martians are just kind of playing it by ear. Right. They don't really have a very specific plan. And that's the other thing, is that Kelston brings up the possibility that and again it is using his big the telescope at the observatory where he works, where he just points the telescope just like a few 90 degrees to one direction, and then he says, all right, look through that telescope, and suddenly we're looking at this giant atomic powered spaceship that is apparently is the top secret project that this kid's daughter, that this little girl's father is working on, that your father is working on, but it's all top secret. And so there's this weird it's this whole weird dynamic to the movie of just, again, there's a lot of shots and sequences that are just built around looking, and this horrific revelation of something that's hidden in this apparently innocent little town, but sort of manifests the dark undercurrent of it. So Keystone makes this proposition that, what the Martians are doing is just a logical response to what we are doing. And that that they're, and even I think he even more or less proposes that for them it's a matter of self-defense. But then when David is, and the doctor lady, the child psychologist, Patricia, Dr. Blake, played by Helena Carter, when they're kidnapped by the Martians, who are led, it's just a couple of mutants led by a brain in a bottle. Like, the brain's only motivations seem to just be, we're just going to take over, it's like, so there's this weird disjuncture between, so like Kelston, apropos of nothing, knows immediately that the Martians are like using these synthetic human mutant slaves, which become revealed later. But then he's not right about the, there's this dissonance within the story between what is revealed and what is just sort of left off screen and not even addressed and sort of dropped at the, it's a very spontaneous narrative. It's not like, and I guess that's what I mean by it not seeming to be tethered to any kind of conventional logic.
I suppose this is as good a place as any to stop for a second just to establish the pedigree of the filmmaking behind it, because we are about to start talking about the use of the set in the film, the main set of the backyard of David's house. So I thought, without being able to give my listener the privilege of seeing the set, I guess I'm just going to have to talk about the pedigree of the person who directed the film and more or less was also the chief special effects and production design artist for it. And pedigree is definitely the right term because of all the filmmakers covered on this podcast. He's definitely the one who seems to have had the most, not only the most prolific career, but definitely the most revered and conventionally successful. That man is, of course, William Cameron Menzies. Menzies' early experience was in graphic design for advertisements and children's book illustrations. After meeting Anton Grot, a Polish art director active in Hollywood, he began working in special effects and art direction for silent films in the early 1920s. One of his earliest credits was the 1924 Douglas Fairbanks film, The Thief of Baghdad, cementing him as one of the era's most innovative art directors. He exerted a greater degree of creative control than most art directors, not only producing meticulous proofs and notes for sets, but also instructing cinematographers on how to shoot them. Not just a designer, he demonstrated himself as a man with a full grasp of cinema as a photographic and technical medium, an attribute that would help him on the rare occasion when he branched out into directing himself, especially on quite low-budget productions, of which Invaders from Mars is probably his most famous, tied only perhaps with his own, much earlier H.G. Wells adaptation, Things to Come, in 1936. He earned his greatest prestige and his most lasting legacy in classic Hollywood for his work on David O. Selznick's blockbuster Gone with the Wind, for which he won an Academy Award. Even for its low budget, Invaders from Mars, it reflects the sort of experience of this filmmaker and his ability to uniquely understand how to create a film that wasn't just about the superficial content, but had a unique, evocative, emotional effect on the audience through its specific visual and aesthetic qualities. And you see that absolutely, especially in that single set piece. It's the surrealism of the work, the expressionism of it, it's not simply an imitation of the past. It is, in fact, a filmmaker who has deep roots in that silent greatness of the early cinema itself, in that specific period where it seemed like the expressive capabilities of cinema without sound, of cinema without talking was ever present and, what even seemed to be the only way of doing things. And I do want to talk about that set piece, because it is where a lot of the budget of the film is bound up. And you're right that it seems like the set piece itself is it's very evocative of the cabinet of the backyard of David's house. Just this very simple hill and fence post leading to this kind of infinite horizon where people just go and then they just disappear.
Well, yeah, right.
Is that it is very evocative of not just the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but German expressionism in general. And I was trying to, and I don't know enough technically about cinematography
or about set design to be able to express why that set piece is so uncanny. But I did manage to find an essay written by a guy named Glenn Erickson. And so he sort of describes the set, the first thing he says is that, it's like, it's part of how the movie works in such an evocative way because the set piece itself is not a literalistic representation of a backyard. It operates by a visual logic which is uncanny and is meant to remove us from a sense of secure reality. So the way he describes it is that quote, it's a reverse forced perspective optical illusion, a deep set that is purposely made to appear shallow. So the set itself that it was constructed, the thing that they put most of the budget of this movie into, is very deep. So, but it's shot and constructed in such a way that it appears to be much more shallow than it actually is. So the result is that, George and Mary, David's father and mother, they seem to get smaller than they should as they reach the top of the hill, and they take a lot of steps to get there, but the trees at the rear of the set don't give the right perspective clues, so it almost looks as if the couple is shrinking as they walk. So, like, the set itself is constructed in such a way and shot in such a way that they seem to be getting smaller and smaller, despite the fact that it looks like to us,
right,
like they're only walking a short amount of distance.
Right. I agree with that. Yes.
And it's sort of like, there's almost like a sort of, and again, it comes back to the surrealist.
Well, like Caligari, the same thing. If you notice when the guys walk, again, you're right. The set piece looks much closer, but it looks like the guy is walking up and over and over and around.
Right.
So
and that's a very, and that, it's, again, that's sort of the optical illusion where the set itself is actually much deeper than it appears to us. Mm-hmm. And so you get this, and so it's kind of disheartening because so much of the budget of the movie is bound up in that one set. There's not a lot of other places in the movie that have that sort of optical trickery.
Well, maybe that's good.
Which is not to say that the rest of the film isn't evocative. There's a lot of great minimalist set design throughout the movie. A lot of sort of optical illusion. I specifically love how much low angle photography is done. So again, it's not just a story about a child, but the perspective of the camera is often frequently from a child's point of view, pointed up at the world, rather than from an adult's perspective. So I think those things are very effective.
I mean, the shooting, really, the actual shooting is wonderful, but that set is, but then again, the set, as we know, the set is a dream, right? So at least we think it's a dream.
Well, that's the twist ending of the story.
So maybe there's something to it. Just like any dream, nothing's really real. Things are closer than they are. You run, but you can't run very fast. But you don't go
anywhere. Yeah, and that's also a motif of the climax where, and where they're about to blow up the Martian spaceship, but as the characters are running away, the same shot of the characters running from one point will be repeated over and over again, so it doesn't seem like they're moving anywhere. There's also a great, most of it is just them running. Yeah, there's a shot that's of just a close-up of David as he's running away, but he's just on a treadmill, so he's not really going anywhere. Yeah, it's it's a very effective capturing of not just a dream logic, but what it's like to be in a nightmare.
Right.
That's very specific, especially a child's nightmare. Just the small things that you can take away from our basic knowledge of how reality works, where if I keep walking, I'll eventually move somewhere. But, especially if you're a child, once you're in that REM sleep, once you're dreaming, something and I can remember my own dreams like that, where it's just something as simple as I walk or I run, but I don't move anywhere. You know, just something as simple as that is just incredibly disconcerting and terrifying, and I think it's conveyed very effectively in the movie. And you kind of gave it away, but yeah, that
well,
does,
I mean, you're not
that
giving it
does,
away. That's what the movie is.
yeah, the twist ending of the movie is that it is all David's dream. You know, once the bomb goes off, and again, there's these weird editing techniques, like events from the movie while he's trying to run away will be superimposed.
Right.
Like, basically the entire narrative of the movie is superimposed over him running, but some shots will, like, go in reverse, but it's not like the entire linear plot is shown in reverse.
Like a dream.
It's random.
Dreams are like that,
It's like
right?
you're waking up. It's
Right.
like, you know, the exact sort of sensation of everything kind of condensing. And then he wakes up and he goes to his mother and father, and he's very...
Well, the point is that also, you know, it's something kind of interesting, although this is not unusual, is that many of those cut pieces that are overlaid with that running sequence at the end, he's off camera, he doesn't even know what's going on, and yet they're shown.
Yeah.
So that tells you that, obviously, it's his imagination seeing himself outside looking at all these pieces, including himself.
Right.
So, I mean, it sort of gives itself away.
Yeah.
I thought it was just poor use of clip. But then when you realize that it is a dream,
Suddenly
then it makes sense.
Yeah, it all comes
because
tied together.
that's all his brain making up all these images. So therefore...
And I guess, like, and that was part of it for me, too, because we should say, is, like, you're right, like, at a certain point... in the narrative, the terror, you know, just the basic disturbing structure of the story does dissipate, and we get to a point where the entire narrative is basically just David tagging along while the military authorities go to work, you know, assembling, you know, crowding around where the spaceship has landed, getting all... And, of course, there's tremendous amounts of stock footage, just an obscene amount of stock footage that's being used.
There's a little too much stock footage, but it works like a play in many ways. So it's like you're doing a Shakespearean play of a battle scene. The idea is that one shot of the backyard is sufficient, and therefore you could bring stock footage of them surrounding the area to blow it up.
And it still has that sort of surrealist effect, because this stock footage is clearly not taking place in the same, you know, present space as the rest of the narrative. It just kind of interrupts.
Well, it makes it seem like that if you imagine that you're in that piece.
We're shown a lot of tanks, but it's clearly the actual tableau is clearly not as big as that.
But they do manage to put up the spotlights. If you notice in that last scene when the tanks do come in, you can see even in the set piece they put up the spotlights.
Yeah,
they rim. So they had enough foresight to make sure they had those up to give the simulation that with the stock footage is brought in and all. Yeah. And I thought it worked fine.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a contradiction between what the director was trying to do, because I do know that, you know, the use of the stock footage was more or less a, you know, because the director himself had experience in both set design and cinematography, but he was not known particularly for being confident either with, number one, actors, which kind of, you know, unfortunately is given away a little in the movie.
I don't know.
But also editing. And so when it came to editing the movie, it mostly fell on the producer, Edward L. Apperson. And apparently, you know, he did a lot of these things where it's like, again, just a tremendous amount of stock footage that, you know, does not congeal with the narrative. Also, he would just, again, like, he would repeat shots over and over, like, especially when we're underground and the mutants are chasing the soldiers. Yes. We get a lot of the duplication of shots of the Martians going, and apparently, you know, like, again, like, the budgetary motivation of this was literally they did not have enough material to make a feature-length movie. Like, if you were to assemble this movie based on just the original principal photography they shot, it would be maybe 45 minutes maximum. It's a very small movie. But I think that you're right, and it goes back to that thing of, like, that idea of running but never getting anywhere. where even if it's accidental, the stock footage and the use of repeated shots kind of has that effect too, where it's disorienting because we see all of these shots of the military assembling and all of these long sequences of the tanks, all right, the tanks are coming, and the tanks are coming, but they never actually get there. What we see is just this very small diorama, and then once in a while things just get interrupted by this stock footage and these repeated shots, and especially when we're in the underground Martian spaceship, the fact that we do get so many of these repeated shots is that the thing again that it dawned on me is that, like, I have no idea where we're supposed to be, like, spatially. Like, there's no spatial logic. Like, so, like, even in a way, the producer just using these shots...
Well, that's one thing I was ready to say. Well, how the hell do they know how to get out?
Exactly.
Because it got to a point, it got so confusing with all the tunnels and... I said, wait a minute.
And all of them look exactly the same.
Set for 6 minutes, because how do they know they're going to get out from this?
Exactly. Yeah. There's sort of.
Which is okay.
There's things that can be chalked up to a certain amount of just cynicism and just trying to keep the budget low. But I think there is a point to be made that it does sort of assist the film.
Sure it does.
I didn't feel it necessarily while I was watching it, because again, it happens. It is that quality of, at a certain point, David himself becomes peripheral to the plot.
Right.
And it is kind of amazing because once the army gets there, suddenly it's this army general who is the central character, and he's organizing everything, and he's getting the army to come in. He's organizing, like, it's like, all right, the police have been infiltrated, the...
Colonel Fielding, right?
Yeah, exactly. A high-ranking general has been taken over by the Martians and turned into a saboteur. But then the next time we really see David as a character, he's literally just sitting under a tree.
Right.
On his, with his hands on his knees, just bummed out, but no one is paying attention to him. And eventually Dr. Blake goes over to, like, comfort him, and then they get kidnapped by the Martians, and suddenly he becomes a central feature of the story again. But it is, like, again, it's like I was bummed out that, like, it seemed to make him too peripheral to this surrealist story. But then I just think about my own dreams, and I think about, like, I don't know, when you dream, do you ever feel like that is a part of dreaming where sometimes you yourself become peripheral to what's going on? Like, do you ever have dreams where you're just a spectator and there's, like, there just seems to be other pieces and, like, characters, so to speak?
There are characters, but I'm always central.
So you're always central?
Yeah.
I can remember being a kid, and maybe it's just because, the funny thing is, it might just be because I watched so many movies and watched too much TV when I was a kid, but I can remember being a kid and very often having dreams where I start as a central character, but then I will just be disaggregated. Like, something will happen. Like, I might even be watching myself.
Right.
Like, it'll be a weird thing where, like, I'm simultaneously a spectator, but I'm watching myself do things that are outside of my control, and then I'll disappear and other characters will act. So it's like, I think that, the film does sort of successfully sort of have this surreal trajectory to it. And it's so odd because I don't think there's any other, like, even after the movie was made, I don't think there's any other, much less alien invasion movies. I don't think there's a lot of monster movies or B movies from this period that are really anything like this.
No. But it turns out that he wakes up and actually it starts all over again.
Yeah, it's like the greatest thing. Like, and that's the other thing.
And you don't know if he fell back to sleep and he's seeing again, or if it's actually he's awake now and he's seeing.
Yeah, and this is the thing again about the weird effect of the repeated footage, because the way that Jimmy Hunt, the child actor, reacts to the again, like you say, he goes back to bed and he wakes up again and the Martian and everything is repeating itself. But his reaction is not one of someone who's fearful because things are repeating himself. He says the same exact surprise
right
as the beginning. So there's like this it's like a horrific time loop where it's like, again, it's like the quality of a dream. It's like when you wake up from a dream and you know, or a nightmare, and you know that you're terrified. But again, when he's talking to his parents, as soon as he tries to articulate what he's scared of, he doesn't remember it. And so it's like there's this idea of like, so like he's going to repeat this thing over and over again, and like this real horror of like, is he ever going to wake up? Or is he like sort of like that Twilight Zone episode where the man keeps reliving his being condemned by a court and getting executed over and over again. Except in that one, the guy remembers everything that happened before.
I think there's any movies like that where... I don't think so. I think this is one of the few ones where it's a dream sequence. Yeah, the only reason... But to point out that... but there's also the... from a child's perspective is the fear of losing your parents. Which is an interesting quality to the film. He's bummed out under the tree because he realizes that if his little girlfriend dies of a cerebral hemorrhage, and then two of those guys, as soon as they're caught, die of cerebral hemorrhages on the spot. He's worried about his parents dying, and he doesn't want, despite the fact that they're taken over. So it's interesting how, and it's Dr. Carter.
And again, it's another one of these things that's resolved totally off screen.
Right, they capture the parents. They get the parents, and they realize, well, an hour they could be dead. And the idea is they have to blow up the ship to lose, so the Martians no longer have control over the people they've had surgery performed on them. So in many ways, you're right. They do. Well, no, they don't, because we don't see what happens because it's a dream state. He only sees them when he wakes up as real people, not right.
You know what is interesting is that when the movie was sold to a distributor in the United Kingdom, the first thing that happened was that the distributor said, this movie is too short, you need to shoot new sequences. And so the way they extended the movie was that they made the sequence at the observatory. They made that longer. They had Kelston go into more detail about his theories, like showing like little models of spaceships and flying saucers and all this bullshit, basically just extending the plot. But another thing that the United Kingdom edit of the movie changed, that they reshot, was that the ending is that it's now no longer a dream. It's so we abruptly go from the Martian ship being destroyed to Dr. Kelson and Dr. Blake returning David to his house and assuring him, oh, by the way, don't worry, off screen, your parents were successful, the surgery was successful, they got the exploding probes out of their brains, and so everything is going to be okay. It's it's like this very, and apparently it didn't, like the not Wade Wilson, but like, definitely not Wade Wilson, that's Deadpool, but anyway, but there's this weird, it's just a very, it's seemingly a movie that is governed by just this sense of cognitive dissonance that never really gets resolved, because it's this weird quality, isn't it, where like Dr. Kelson and Dr. Blake, as soon as David's parents are turned into monsters, Dr. Kelson and Dr. Blake almost become like adoptive parents to him. Right. And so in a weird way, that United Kingdom ending, despite the fact that he's told that his parents are going to be okay, it effectively ends with Dr. Kelson and Dr. Blake literally becoming adoptive parents to him.
I don't know if that's...
And so there's this whole weird...
Yeah, I don't know if that's...
I mean, like, since it is a movie that is,
I think his main concern are his parents, and the fact that... I don't know. I don't see it that way. I just see it as being the fact that there just happen to be people that... Maybe that's the whole point of a dream, is that they immediately believe him.
Yeah.
And...
Well, they don't just believe him, do they? They take a special interest.
Well, yeah, the whole thing
in the way that others
and
don't.
Then Dr. Kelton, then he goes and calls Colonel Fielding.
Yeah.
And they believe him immediately.
Yeah,
you're right. We got to put up a security around the. We have to get the army involved. And he calls the army. Oh yes, so we're gonna. So everybody's on belief of that, except but I mean, there are little pieces that help it make. For example, when they do observe the general falling into being led by the father and falling into the pit, just so happenstance they put the
and that's the other thing.
The telescope again.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is since it is a movie that is a dream. Since it is all, it's definitely inspired by German Expressionism. So, it seems appropriate to at least, toy with, because it is so explicitly just a movie that is just this sort of, it's like a cyclical narrative that is totally the product of a child's imagination, to sort of probe the idea that, that it is some kind of social commentary in a way that is speaking specifically to the idea of how kids in particular in the 1950s are being affected by anxieties that come from modern crises, whether it's the Cold War or whether it's all this information, this spurious information they're getting about, flying saucers or top secret military experiments or even their relationships with their own parents, because that is sort of this breaking point where, the fact that David's father is taken over by this subterranean clandestine force coincides with the fact that he learns from Kelson that actually your father has effectively been, keeping a secret from you, that he, like a lot of the adults in this town, are working on this top secret installation, this top secret weaponry, this thing that is preparing for a kind of the event of an apocalyptic struggle with our foreign enemies. And it's so there's this way in which the movie seems to speak specifically to an anxiety of not being able to trust one's parents, where it's and I think it's doubled it's helped by the fact that David is an amateur astronomer, and so of course his adoptive father figure is this actual astronomer, and it is weird because before he goes to sleep, he and his father are looking through a telescope at this constellation that is only going to appear and be visible once every 100 years. And then immediately his mom comes in and says, "Okay, it's time for bed." They've only been looking at the thing for 30 seconds.
Right, not even.
Right, and so it's again, even if it's not as serious as Cold War paranoia, I think there is sort of this way we can work through the narrative of in a way that symbolically David is replacing his parents with people who understand him,
right.
Rather than his mother who just doesn't understand him and doesn't support his interests, his wanting to be a professional astronomer and see these beautiful things. Then here comes the beautiful, all effervescently dressed in white Dr. Blake with a big red, flower over her lapel, and then of course it becomes contrasted with his own mother, who is now totally dressed in black and totally taken over by this invasive force. I think the another thing that Glenn Erickson points out in his essay is that besides the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, he of course brings up The Wizard of Oz, which I think is a pretty good movie to use in juxtaposition, and I think the way he sort of talks about it is the difference between a movie that is this escapist narrative of a character who goes into this dream world and then comes out on the other end ready to, tackle life again. It's what is the final line of The Wizard of Oz? It's
there's no place to go.
There's no place like home. The learning the lesson is yeah, kid, you've got everything you need right where you are.
Right.
Versus the narrative of Invaders from Mars, which is not only that there's literally nothing to be done. You're going to keep running and you're never going to escape this nightmarish condition that you're in. Even once it seems like you have awakened from the nightmare, it just keeps repeating itself. And so the way Erickson teases it out is in these two excerpts. It's In Dorothy's circa 1900 world of dull rural sameness, a dream is a chance to escape into a magical realm. Her adventure explains in strange but logical ways how the real world works. Authority figures are without substance, and one's peace is at the whim of representatives of good and bad engaged in struggles that ordinary people can hardly relate to. If she is brave and virtuous, an innocent can find her way and perhaps discover a few truths about herself in the process. Dorothy's Kansas world may have been dull, but it had one quality David McLean's sorely lacks: a sense of security. David's frantic dream is a symptom of the pressures of his daily life, not an escape from it. It's not a magical place over the rainbow that one can enter. David's dream is an alternate reality so close to his real world, he doesn't even know he's left it. So instead of, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, David, much more realistically like someone who's dreaming, they just go headlong and they don't realize that they're dreaming. And, like Dorothy's Oz, David's dream is populated by people he knows, but now they are sinister doppelgangers of their real selves. And one other note he makes is that, Invaders from Mars is that rare film engineered around primal adolescent fears. The nightmare is not only shown from little David's point of view, it is also restricted to his frame of reference and his experiences. If the pressures of 1953 are making adults paranoid, what effect are they having on the children? And so let's sort of tease out, because does end up sort of being what the plot of the story is about, is that, suddenly not just your parents, but everyone from policemen to military figures, all of these people can just be compromised. And it's sort of it's sort of generic in a sense, because when you're a child, not being able to trust any authority figure or believing that any of them are out to get you is terrifying. But in, the specific context of 1953, we can imagine that there's something much more specifically evocative about the idea of, your father becoming some sort of saboteur and assassin, or, a respected general turning out to be part of this, nefarious underground force. And, in the one sense, it does seem like it's just reactionary. Because the literal plot of the movie is, again, that it's just this foreign threat that is coming over, and, one of these favorite motifs of not just alien invasion movies, but of also the Manchurian Candidate, this idea of brainwashing, of mind control, of how, the Russians aren't just going to destroy us with our own weaponry, they're going to, seep their insidious ideology into our minds subliminally, and they're going to take us over and make us do things that kind of harm our values. But it does sort of it comes back to this thing of cognitive dissonance, because then you have a whole scene where Kelson is talking about the fact that, secretly, unbeknownst to you, which is not something that wasn't a reality, especially in middle America around the time, which is that, it's in America, where are you going to conduct a top secret military experiment or development of experimental weaponry? Where are you going to do it? You're not going to conduct it in major cities. You're not going to conduct it in the nation's capital. No, you're going to do it in small towns, and you're going to do it in those places that are obscure, where nobody is going to look because they're not special. And, it even makes me think of, Bowling for Columbine in a way, because there's that whole section in Bowling for Columbine where where Michael Moore calls attention to the fact that, lots of middle American towns in the 90s and the 21st century, they are still hotbeds of military activity. They are still epicenters of where our military arsenals are amassed and protected. And so there's still, even to the present day, there's still this sort of anxiety about, there doesn't seem to be, there's no transparency with how the military or the government operates, but there's so little barrier between our civilian lives and our military lives. Everything is sort of engulfed in this, in this parade of jingoism. And specifically that scene, like, you know, again, just like the way it's conveyed of, like, he just turns the telescope and says, look through it, here is the secret of the town. So, like, there's almost this horror...
Well, they knew it was there. The idea is you can't go on the property.
Well, he knew something...
It's not a secret.
He knew something top secret was going on, but
right.
it takes... And again, it's like this weird... Again, the dream logic of, like,
right.
how did nobody notice this giant space shuttle in the middle of the town? It was like, again, it's the dream logic. It's
right.
like you can't know it until it's shown to you. But once it is shown, you know, it becomes this weird thing of, like, suddenly this isn't just the story or what David's mind is conjuring. He's not just afraid of, like, you know, Sputnik. He's not just afraid of invasions from Russia or Cuba. He's afraid of something that's going on. You know, part of his anxiety is coming from what's, you know, homegrown. It's coming from what's coming out of just the daily life of living in America. So there's, like, he's sort of taking all of these disparate elements from the real world, and they're sort of manifesting themselves in a dissonant way that allows us to, you know, sort of appreciate the idea that, you know, it's not propagandistic,
right.
that this is not the story of the brave military coming to rescue David and you know, all the innocence from the evil alien invaders, that this is a part of the, you know, the horror of the story is something that's growing out of America's weird sort of paranoid jingoistic condition at the time.
I just like this thing here that they according to this thing from Wikipedia, which is interesting, is that the bubbling of the special effects with the infrared was done by boiling oatmeal that was colored with food coloring.
That's one way to do it.
And the other one is
they have the Martians have a weapon that just sort of boils rock to the point that it explodes.
And it was really interesting is that when you go into the tunnels, obviously they almost look like styrofoam that's been bubbled.
Yeah.
Which is a really good effect. They tried inflating balloons. They didn't like the way they looked, so they used latex condoms.
I think that's apocryphal.
Oh, well,
like both of the Glenn Erickson resources and that Keep Watching the Skies, Bill Warren's book on sci-fi movies. I think that's apocryphal. I think you're right that they used they used latex, but it was not like literally inflated.
Doesn't make sense because they wouldn't have the right shape. 3,000 of them sticking. It doesn't make sense that they would have been. I mean, I imagined but it was a good effect, and it was kind of interesting. And
it was apparently also supposed to be 3D. They were originally going to shoot it in 3D, but I guess they just didn't have the budget for it. It should be said that at the same time, in the same year, the director William Cameron Menzies, he did make a 3D horror movie called The Maze, but that was for a different company than this one. This one ended up getting distributed by 20th Century Fox. So it got distributed by a pretty major studio, but which makes it all the more amazing to me that its preservation status is so poor that, like, you know, there's been no attempt at an earnest restoration of this movie, even though it is the closest thing that came out of these old 50s B movies to, like, an actual art film. Because it doesn't really work as, like, a conventional monster movie, does it? Like,
no, I mean, it's good. I think I was generally pleased with the picture. I thought it was really good. It wasn't that long either, which is even better. The fact that
it teaches very good lessons, you know, such as, you know, crime does not pay. Right, you know, the true monster is man. Yeah, keep watching the skies. Yeah, I was very very entertained by it.
Yep.